This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the box was cardboard, the detective was dying, and the bridge was Thor, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
Have you ever stopped to wonder why James Phillimore disappeared looking for his umbrella? Or just how parsley can manage to sink into the butter?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 431, Alleged Cocaine Use by Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
Allegedly.
Yes, allegedly.
How can we be sure?
Ledge. Get off your ledge and keep leaning this way.
I always have to lean in with you. It's mostly because I'm trying to hear what you're saying.
What?
Huh?
What?
What? Well, we have one of our episodes dedicated to a Morley-Montgomery Award-winning article. This is an article of significant stature that it was called out from all of the other surrounding articles that year in the Baker Street Journal. And this season, we are picking out 12 such examples. The latest one we have is from 1969 by William H. Miller, M.D., F.C.A.P. I believe that's Fellow of the College of American Psychiatrists, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, I thought it was front-facing cap. I thought it was like a thing you wore. Yeah.
F.C.A.P. It's
F-cap.
an F-cap.
I've got my F-cap on because I've got the brim pointed in front of me. Yeah.
Well, if it's a deerstalker, you don't know whether you're coming or going.
I never know whether I'm
Is that
coming or
part
going.
of the attraction of a deerstalker, is that the deer wouldn't be able to tell which way the hunter was facing?
I think the primary attraction is that if you're laying out there in the rain in the woods, it's hunting, the rain isn't going to drip down the back of your neck.
Oh.
I think it's the neck covering.
Okay. It'll just drip down your ears.
Yeah.
Unless you have the ear flaps down.
They were probably designing the deerstalker, and somebody said, we should have something to protect the neck. And then somebody else said, well, I got 2 of these brims. And they said, okay, good.
Well, we'll leave that for another episode of Trifles. In this case, we're going to be looking at Dr. Miller's article from the 1969 issue of the Baker Street Journal, Volume 19, Number 3. It's titled Some Observations on the Alleged Use of Cocaine by Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Why alleged? Why cocaine? Well, we'll see very shortly as we discuss this article. Meanwhile, if you'd like to support the show, you can do so on Patreon or Substack for as little as $1 a month. You can help us continue to produce and research this show, bring you the quality programming that you've come to know from a couple of Baker Street irregulars like ourselves. Every week we do this little show. We are now in the 9th season, our 431st episode. Hard to believe we've been doing it for that long. But we keep going thanks to your support and inspiration. You can check those out in the show notes, which are available in whatever podcast app you happen to be listening to us on. Or you can go directly to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com, and you'll find links to our Patreon and our Substack in those notes. Or just go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. And thank you in advance. Well, here we are. Dr. William H. Miller going to give us a what the editor of A Remarkable Mixture calls a scholarly but readable overview of Holmes's involvement with drugs and a discussion about just what drugs they might have been. Now, this is fascinating to me, Bert, because I think we are all pretty much used to considering Sherlock Holmes a cocaine user. But we know Watson calls out at least one other drug with respect to Holmes's use. And I think it was at the Sign of Four.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And that's morphine.
We don't actually have any evidence of Holmes using morphine that we know of, do we?
No, other than that reference, I don't think there is any.
Huh. Well, and that's when you consider that as the background, this is why I think Dr. Miller's piece is so fascinating to me. What proof do we actually have? So why don't we hop to it and see what he shares with us?
Yeah, and I should point out to our listeners that this is a paper from September of 1969, and the issue about cocaine, understanding its function, all of this about drugs and addictive behavior really need to be considered in terms of the time in which it was written about and these ideas came down on the page. And that's important for two reasons. One is to put Miller's essay in that sort of context, because from 1969 to 2025, a lot has happened, and there's a different understanding of the psychological and medical and pharmacological interactions of all of this stuff. But also, back in Holmes's time, there had been practically, well, I don't think practically, I think completely zero research into that we would consider to have been useful today at the time about how all this stuff worked and what its implications were and how addiction developed. So just sort of a heads up there. But Miller, begins right away, again, by talking about the time. He says the present opprobrium attending the extramedical use of narcotic drugs. So he's referring to the fact that drug use is a bad thing, would seem to demand an investigation of the alleged use of drugs by Mr. Sherlock Holmes. And he will, in the next two paragraphs, cite a number of papers that had come his way, come into his notice. He says, in this particular paper by this particular professor, he accepts without question Holmes' use of cocaine and dismisses it as a confirmation of his very humanity, his very humanness, he says. And he points out that many people, the effects of continued use of cocaine have been described by lots of people. This one says, frankly, psychotic symptoms are common among those who continue the use of large doses of cocaine over a prolonged period. People say the moral deterioration in the cocaine addict is even greater than in the morphine habitué. In another textbook, he observes the people who are involved in taking these substances are of the neurotic class. And in that description, it's pointed out the moral degradation often is greater than from morphinism, and the chance of ending the habit is less. So again, this is sort of, the papers that have come this fellow's way in the 1960s and the current thinking here.
Yeah, and we should be clear that, these are mostly medical papers he's talking about. I think there's only one Sherlockian paper he quotes, and that is, as he says, Professor Coley, Poisons in the Canon, which was in Leaves from the Copper Beeches in 1959. The rest are modern clinical psychiatry, principles and practice of medicine, medical jurisprudence and toxicology, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very medico-scholarly kind of approach to Sherlock Holmes, rather than more of a study of the literature of Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, exactly. Well summarized. And he goes on to cite other references here. Another scholar, a medical authority he cites, reports Glaister. In addition to the signs of physical degeneration which are apparent, addicts frequently suffer from psychical degeneration, which commonly assumes the form of insanity. Barr, another reference here, continues this unhappy recital by noting not infrequently true insanity develops. Matheson, in his delightful account of drugs, states that Holmes, who apparently joy-popped with cocaine, was using one of the few drugs which definitely inspire criminal actions. Note his use of the word apparently, writes Miller. A final word from the classical textbook of Goodman and Gilman will conclude this gloomy picture. These authors comment that the cocaine addict is not a normal individual, but is often a dangerous and debased person.
Now, recall, this is 1969. This is a respected physician who was kind of looking down his nose at anyone who uses drugs. And let's be clear, too, earlier in this volume 19 of the Baker Street Journal, in number 1, David Wallace had written a paper called Sherlock Holmes, the First Hippie. So we are square within the 60s counterculture and the traditionalists who kind of turn their noses up at a drugged up Sherlock Holmes. And we'll see Dr. Wallace here coming to the defense of Holmes and his reputation. He notes that the descriptions that you just heard were the effects of long-term usage. And in the Sign of the Four, Watson tells us 3 times a day for as many months is how often he saw Holmes using the drug. And that would constitute long-term usage. But what about the immediate action, he wonders? The symptoms appearing after its use. He says they will manifest in garrulity, restlessness, and excitement. There's some evidence that mental powers are increased, and that is according to L. Goodman and A. Gilman in the Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics from 1941. So, and he said that, of course, you're going to see those mental powers increase. But after that, you get the down. There's evidence that the stimulation is replaced by depression, and the higher centers are first depressed. And larger doses mean that, of course, you're going to have cerebral stimulation of the higher centers, but stimulation of lower centers. So then you're going to see things like convulsions and tremors happening. So there will be physical effects as well as the mental stimulant.
Interesting. Well, I would just echo what you pointed out here, which is that our author here, again, William Miller, Dr. William Miller, has gone through some of these negative statements, all so that he could get to the point of his mid-paragraph here. The character of Holmes, as you just mentioned, he writes, should dispel immediately a belief in his addiction, for no one could consider him a debased person or a moral degenerate. So this is Miller sort of making his argument here that no. Holmes was not an addict. And so then he goes on to ask, so what suggestions or proof do we have of Holmes's use of cocaine anyway? The chief suggestion is his own words that he was using cocaine in a 7% solution. But we're taking this out of context. Watson prompted this by saying, which is it today, morphine or cocaine? Well, such a question, writes Miller, posed to an English gentleman may easily have been construed as shocking cheek and worthy of a calm rebuff. So this is Miller's second point here. Look at the context, and maybe Holmes wasn't taking cocaine at all. So then he goes on to say, what then was in the syringe?
And he drops this truth bomb on us at the time. In that era, there were 4 drugs that were used hypodermically: morphine, atropine, ergotine, and quinine. And of course, these days we have a much longer list of injectable drugs. But back then, this was the limit, right? So he says it should be easy to pick the correct one that Holmes was taking. Morphine has been excluded. Ergotine is used in obstetrics and for the treatment of migraine. He said Holmes may have had headaches, but not necessarily migraines. And his interest in obstetrics was more of the entrepreneur than the accoucheur. I'm going to have to get out my dictionary for that one. And then quinine, he says, is rarely used by injection. And those kinds of injections were painful and could actually have some deleterious side effects related to the tissue, which leaves us with atropine. Right? So, and he reminds us that Stamford observed that Holmes would experiment with different substances, a little pinch of vegetable alkaloid he might test out on a friend, and he'd try it out himself with the same readiness. So he's got an interest in experimental pharmacology, and that means that he might be willing to experiment on himself with respect to atropine. Of course, Watson, he reminds us, had described Holmes's knowledge of chemistry as profound. He of course knew a good deal about belladonna, nightshade, etc. But let's recall belladonna. Even though it's got a close chemical makeup of atropine, belladonna was more of a topical kind of thing, an ointment or something you would rub on the skin. So it wasn't typically something that would be injected.
I remember, do you remember those old road pictures with Bing Crosby and Bob Hope? Wasn't belladonna like the sister of Carmen Miranda? I'm pretty sure. She wound up.
That was the road to Baker Street, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I love that picture.
On the road to Baker Street.
Well, so we're dealing here with our pal Dr. Miller here in this review of other things that Holmes might have been percolating around with his syringe. Deadly nightshade, atropine, hyoscyamine, atropine, scopolamine. He points out, the close chemical similarity between atropine, scopolamine, and cocaine. And as you say, belladonna, poor old belladonna, she was used for topical relief here. While he was working with this drug, says Miller, its interesting pharmacological properties undoubtedly came to his attention. The fact that it has both sedative and tranquilizing effects may have induced its use and have been especially appreciated at times when Holmes was between cases and suffered from ennui. It's entirely conceivable that while he was experimenting with doses of this drug and noting its various influences in combination with other drugs, one of its more surprising properties came to light. When scopolamine is administered with other sedative drugs, a state of deep sleep, similar to unconsciousness, is produced. Now, I would point out that today we have podcasts that can achieve this sense of somnambula. Wake up there, listeners. Wake up. Wake up. During such a state, questions put to the seemingly unconscious subject are often answered with striking truth and accuracy. And following
Truth
this narcosis... Truth serum, right. Following this narcosis, there's complete amnesia for the events taking place during the period. Imagine the delight, Miller writes, following quickly by the regret that Holmes must have experienced when he realized that the method of interrogation he'd discovered would be as valuable to criminals as it would be to police, because secrets could easily be arrested from abducted government workers, and blackmailers would have a weapon that would make the nefarious Milverton seem little more than a peeping Tom.
This is similar to the plot of one of the Rathbone Bruce movies, but that was hypnosis they were using, not truth serum, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. That was the Woman in Green.
Woman in Green, that's the one. I'm
pretty sure. Yeah, she has this deadly bowl of water that orchids are floating in.
Beware the bowl of water, kids. So, as we look at that potential usage of scopolamine, Miller writes that these are valid enough reasons for discontinuing his researches, but surely the most important reason of all must have been the realization that such a drug and such a method might end the science of deduction in criminology. And so he stopped experimenting. And of course, he didn't want to burden Watson with this knowledge and require Watson keep this secret. So it wasn't until, 30 years later that there was the first case of a criminal interrogation under scopolamine reported by Dr. E. House in the Texas State Journal of Medicine in 1922.
Played by Hugh Laurie.
That was G. House.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, this was E. House. And then you had to get to F. House, and then we get to G. House.
To G. Yeah. All my mail was sent over to F. House, and I never got it. Well, then, in conclusion, Dr. Miller says, let me state that there can be no doubt that Sherlock Holmes was not addicted to narcotic drugs.
Not addicted, he says.
Not addicted. You see, this is the whole point. He gave us this litany of terrors about cocaine usage in the beginning, all to say that, that doesn't really support Holmes. And in fact, there's no evidence that he took it. And maybe it was just, in the context of the conversation, a wry remark. And then he's gone into all of this other options that he could have been exploring. A knowledge of the man himself and his abilities, as well as the few drugs available for hypodermic injection during the time of Holmes's experimentation, has made possible the elementary deductions that lead us to the true contents of his syringe.
Well, perhaps it was Dr. Conan Doyle who had hoped for a speedy departure of his hero and saddled him with this unlikely drug addiction.
Well, Conan Doyle never presented him as being addicted. He just presented him as being a dabbler in it, I think. A fancier of it.
That is fancy.
Well, it's also a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What is it tonight? Morphine? Or cocaine?
Well, I can strongly recommend a 7% solution of cocaine. Would you care to try it?